What's up guys, it's Serge, and welcome back to my series of music theory lessons. Last lesson I explained what intervals are, and today's lesson I'm going to explain how we use intervals to create triads and chords.
If you remember from my second lesson, a chord is a series of notes being played simultaneously. But what notes do we choose from? Well, let's look at something called a triad. A triad is a 3-note chord that we stack in third intervals. I have used the note C a lot in talking about scales and intervals, so I'm going to focus on a different note today. I'm going to focus on using the note G to build our triads and chords. What I mean by this is that G is going to be the root of our chords. Remember in my lesson about scales, the note that we start the scale on is called our fundamental. This applies to chords as well. The root note should be the note that sticks out to you the most. It's the foundation of our chord. So again, how do we build these chords? Okay, so we're going to first make a major triad. Remember, major sounds lighter and happy, so let's start with our root note G. We will throw our root note on the bottom. As I said earlier, a triad is stacked in thirds. So to finish this major triad, I will add the note that's a major third above G, which is B. Then I will add the note that's a minor third above B, which is D. So again, from our root to the next note is a major third, and from that note to the next note is a minor third. Here's what the whole triad sounds like. Now also notice that from our root note G to our top note D is a perfect fifth interval. If we look at the G major scale, we have G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. G is our first note and D is our fifth note. So G to D is a perfect fifth. So when we look at this triad, musicians will refer to G as our root, B as our third, and D is our fifth of the triad. Now let's look at how to make a minor triad. Remember, minor sounds dark and sad? We will start with G again as our root note. We build this triad the opposite way as the major triad. We will start with a minor third first, so this would be G to B flat. Then on top of B flat, we will have a major third, which is the note D. And as we had before with the major triad, from our root to our fifth is still a perfect fifth from G to D. Here's what the whole triad sounds like. You can also reference the G minor scale to find our root, third, and fifth. Let's look at another triad. We're going to build this with 2 minor third intervals now. So G is our root, a minor third above that is B flat, and a minor third above B flat is D flat. Now what is the interval from our root to our fifth? G to D is a perfect fifth, but what is G to D flat? This is, if you remember from my intervals lesson, this is called a diminished fifth. I talked about this in my last lesson, but to quickly recap, a diminished fifth is 1/2 step lower than a perfect fifth. So what do we call this triad? We call this triad a diminished triad. It contains 2 minor thirds stacked on top of each other, and the interval between the root and the fifth is a diminished fifth interval. Let's look at one more triad. The next triad contains 2 major thirds stacked on top of each other. So G is our root, a major third above G is B, and a major third above B is D sharp. What is the interval from our root to the fifth? Well, do you remember what we call an interval where the fifth is 1/2 step higher than the perfect fifth? We call this an augmented fifth. So G to D sharp is an augmented fifth. So what is this whole triad called? This is called an augmented triad. 2 major thirds stacked on top of each other, and we have an augmented fifth from our root to our fifth. Here's what the whole triad sounds like. If you remember from my last lesson about intervals, you need to find ways to remember intervals so you could recognize them when you hear them. You need to do the same thing with triads and chords, in my opinion. If you go to websites like musictheory.net or teoria.com, these websites have exercises where you can practice hearing these intervals and chords, and it tests you on what you are hearing. Now, do we stop there? No. Ever heard of seventh chords? We have a few key seventh chords to learn. Let's go back to our major triad. Our root is G, our third is B, and our fifth is D. Let's throw a major third on top of D. This would be F sharp. What do we call this chord? We call this chord G major seventh. Let's look back at our G major scale. Our root is G, our third is B, our fifth is D, and our seventh is F sharp. It's helpful to reference the respective scales to see what our notes should be. Now take away that F sharp. We still have our G major triad, but instead of going a major third on top of D, let's add a minor third instead. This note would be F. Let's hear this whole chord. We call this chord G dominant seventh or just G7. A dominant seventh chord contains a major triad with a flat 7 from our major scale. If we look at our G major scale again, G is our root, B is our third, D is our fifth, and we don't use the F sharp in this case. we lowered a half step to make it F. This is actually from a mode called Mixolydian, which I will talk about modes in a later lesson. Let's look at another 7th chord. If we look back at our G minor triad again, we have G, B flat, and D. Let's add a minor third on top of D, which is F. This 7th chord is called a minor 7th chord. This G minor 7th chord contains our root, flat 3, 5, and flat 7. If we look at our G major and G minor scales back to back, our minor scale has the flat 3, 5, and flat 7 compared to the major scale notes. So these 4 notes from the minor scale create our minor 7th chord. Okay, let's learn 2 more 7th chords for now. Let's look back at our G diminished triad again. We have 1, flat 3, and flat 5, which are G, B flat, and D flat. If we add a major third on top of D flat, we have the note F. We now have something called a half diminished 7th chord, which is also called minor 7 flat 5. It's called this because we have the minor 7th chord, but the 5th of the chord is lowered a half step. It has a very interesting sound, unlike the others we've heard so far. Here's what it sounds like. Okay, here's the last chord I'll show in this video. Let's look at G half diminished 7th again. We have G, B flat, D flat, and F. Now I'm going to lower that F a half step and make it an F flat. So that top interval we have from D flat to F flat is a minor third. Let's hear what the whole chord sounds like. This chord is called G diminished 7th or G fully diminished 7th. We have a diminished triad with a diminished 7th interval from our root to our 7th. Remember in my last lesson, I explained that the interval a half step lower than a minor interval is a diminished interval. So a G to F is a minor 7th interval. A G to F flat is called a diminished 7th interval. You may also notice that this whole chord is fully stacked with minor third intervals. We have a lot of other chords to learn, but this video is meant to give you a foundation of how many chords are constructed. If I play, for example, a G chord, aka G major, on my guitar, I'm technically playing 6 notes because I have 6 strings, but I'm only using 3 notes. Oh, what do you mean by that? So what notes are in our G major triad again? We have G, B, and D. So what am I playing on guitar? First we have a G, then B, then D, then G again, then B again, and then a G on top. So I'm only using those 3 notes even though some of them are higher octaves. My advice is to use these websites to train your ears and to hear these chords and recognize them. That concludes this lesson. Next lesson I will discuss what keys and functions are in music to actually create a piece of music. If you like what you saw, subscribe. If not...
Last lesson I explained what intervals are. In today's lesson I'm going to explain how to forget your line.